Okay, today we will be reading the text Mexican Americans fought on both sides of the U.S. Civil War. So we're down to under the image. Thousands of Mexican Americans joined the Confederacy, but even more joined the Union. So before we begin, go ahead and take a moment, stop and jot. Did you know that Mexican Americans fought in the Civil War? If yes, what do you know about it? Okay, now to the text. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, there were tens of thousands of Mexican Americans living in California, Texas, and the New Mexico Territory, all former parts of Mexico that the U.S. had claimed in the 1840s. With the wounds of the Mexican-American War fresh, these Mexican Americans now found themselves in the middle of the United States war with itself. At first, Tejanos, aka Mexican Americans in Texas, tried to avoid declaring support for either side, writes Sonia Hernandez, a professor of history and Latina, and Mexican American studies at Texas A&M University in an email. Some outright avoided joining either side because Tejanos were accused of disloyalty even before the war officially broke out, she writes. Tejanos could avoid conscription, that means joining the war, by claiming Mexican citizenship, and some were in fact Mexican citizens. Still others, overwhelmed with the growing divide, chose sides. So take a moment, you can pause and answer, what conclusions can you draw about how Mexican Americans felt about the Civil War? Okay, down below that image, we're starting at Jerry D. Thompson. Jerry D. Thompson, a history professor at Texas A&M International University, estimates that a few thousand Mexican Americans joined the Confederate troops and over 10,000 joined the Union Army and militia. Though there was some overlap, most Mexican Americans who joined the Union lived in U.S. territory of New Mexico or the state of California, while most joined the Confederacy lived in Texas, one of the states that seceded. At least 2,500 Tejanos joined the Confederate Army. Mexico had banned slavery in 1829, several years after it won its independence from Spain, and some Mexican Americans may have joined the Union because they opposed U.S. slavery. There is some evidence that there was a mini underground railroad here in South Texas that was largely fueled by Tejanos, usually poor Tejanos, who would help run slaves escape into Mexico, says Thompson. We know there were thousands of runaway slaves in Mexico. How would you compare the Mexicans that joined the Confederacy with those that joined the Union? Pause and answer. At the same time, now we're moving on. At the same time, there were wealthy Americans who owned slaves, and those whose income depended on the slave trade. You also had well-to-do individuals like Colonel Santos Benavides here in Laredo, who actually became the highest-ranking Tejano officer in the Confederate Army, says Thompson. There are instances of him acting as a slave catcher, where he's actually going into Mexico and retrieving these runaway slaves and returning them to their masters, for which he was compensated or given money. The desertion abandonment rate among Mexican American Civil War soldiers was high, mostly because of the prejudice they experienced from white soldiers on both sides, according to the National Park Service. There was even one Tejano captain, Adrian J. Vidal, who joined the Confederacy, deserted for the Union, then deserted again to fight against the French imperialists in Mexico who supported the Confederacy. What facts would you select to support that Mexican soldiers faced some difficult decisions on both sides of the war? Pause and answer. Next section. There were other reasons Mexican Americans may have wanted to join the Union. In the early 1840s, the white-run Republic of Texas had invaded New Mexico. Then